In 2012, DC didn't just have a franchise, they had a monopoly on cool. The Dark Knight was still the highest grossing superhero movie ever made. Christopher Nolan had turned Batman into prestige cinema. Critics who normally sneered at comic book movies were writing essays about it.
The Oscar goes to Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight.
Heath Ledger won an Oscar for playing a comic book villain. Marvel was making fun movies about a guy in a metal suit, and DC was winning awards. That's where we were. That's what they threw away. Here's the thing nobody talks about when they blame Zack Snyder or James Gunn or Dwayne Johnson. The rot started at the top, and it started the moment Warner Brothers looked at Iron Man's opening weekend numbers and completely lost their minds. They didn't ask what made The Dark Knight great. They didn't ask what DC actually was or what it stood for. They asked one question: how fast can we copy Marvel? That single question poisoned everything that came after it. DC had one advantage Marvel could never touch: every single character. Marvel had sold Spider-Man to Sony, the X-Men to Fox, the Fantastic Four to Fox, sold their crown jewels for pennies during bankruptcy in the 90s. DC owned Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Aquaman, Green Lantern, the entire Justice League, every single one of them, no strings attached. They could have taken 5 years, built something careful and deliberate and uniquely DC, and lapped Marvel entirely. Instead, they gave themselves 3 years and hired a director whose last movie had made $185 million. Man of Steel wasn't a disaster. Let's be honest about that. $668 million, a genuinely compelling origin. Hans Zimmer's score was incredible, and Henry Cavill looked exactly like someone had pulled Superman out of a comic panel and dropped him into real life. The problem wasn't the movie, the problem was what Warner decided it meant. They didn't see a foundation, they saw permission to sprint, so they announced everything. Batman vs. Superman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, The Flash, Suicide Squad, Justice League, all of it announced publicly before Batman vs. Superman had finished a single day of filming. They were announcing sequels to movies that didn't exist yet. They were scheduling Justice League before they knew if anyone liked their Superman. Marvel had spent 4 years and 6 movies building toward Avengers. Warner gave themselves 3 years and 2 movies. You don't build a house by announcing the roof before you've poured the foundation. Batman vs. Superman had the biggest comic book movie announcement in history. San Diego Comic-Con 2013, the director walked out and read those words: "I will not bow to you." And the crowd lost its mind. 2 years of hype, 2 years of Warner Brothers. The movie came out and a massive portion of the audience walked out confused. $870 million. That sounds like winning. That is not winning. Civil War came out 2 months later, Marvel's version of the same concept, heroes fighting heroes, and made $1.5 billion. But the number isn't even the real damage. The real damage was the feeling people left with. Nobody walked out of Civil War wondering what they just watched. Everybody walked out of Batman vs. Superman having an argument. When your biggest movie becomes a debate, you've already lost. Warner's solution was to hack Suicide Squad apart in post-production. After seeing the Batman vs. Superman backlash, they hired the people who cut the trailer to it. Wonder Woman was the one moment where everything aligned. Patty Jenkins made a film that didn't feel like it was apologizing for anything. It had a beginning, a middle, an end. It had warmth. Gal Gadot made you believe every single second of it. $822 million and unanimous praise, which at that point felt like DC fans finally exhaling after 3 years of holding their breath. It shouldn't have been remarkable that a superhero movie was good and people liked it. In the context of the DCEU, it felt like a miracle. They wasted it instantly. Zack Snyder left Justice League mid-production after a family tragedy, and instead of pausing, instead of making any decision that prioritized the actual film, Warner brought in Joss Whedon and told him to lighten the tone in 2 months of reshoots. Henry Cavill had a mustache he'd grown for another movie and contractually couldn't shave. And this is real, millions of dollars digitally removing a mustache from the face of Superman. They spent more money erasing facial hair than most countries spend on their entire film industry. The CGI lip became a symbol of the entire production. Everything underneath was false, patched together, and slightly off in a way you couldn't stop staring at. Justice League made $657 million, the most expensive film they'd ever made, the worst box office return they'd had. The movie that was supposed to be the culmination of everything, their Avengers moment, was instead the film everyone made fun of, and then Ray Fisher came forward about Whedon's behavior on set, and then Gal Gadot said something similar, and then Affleck said he was done, and then the executive structure collapsed when AT&T bought the company. In 12 months, DC went from releasing Justice League to not knowing who was in charge, who was still employed, or what the universe even was anymore. Aquaman grossing $1.1 billion in 2018 is genuinely one of the most statistically improbable things to ever happen in Hollywood. By every reasonable measure, nobody should have shown up. It was a sequel to the movie that had just set a franchise record for audience disappointment. It starred a character most people considered a joke. It had Jason Momoa talking to fish. It made more money than any DC film in history. James Wan directed the underwater sequences like he was personally trying to destroy every excuse audiences had for not caring, and it somehow worked. It bought DC 2 more years they absolutely did not deserve. What followed was a rotating cycle of abandoned plans, fired actors, canceled films, and restructured universes. Henry Cavill returned to Superman publicly on Instagram and was let go before the post went cold. Batgirl was filmed, completed, screened, and then canceled and buried in a tax write-off. A decision so strange it became a Hollywood urban legend. Dwayne Johnson spent 10 years developing Black Adam, convinced Warner to build an entire Superman cameo around it to make himself look important, and the movie still lost money. The Flash, which had been in development since 2014, finally arrived in 2023 with visual effects that looked like a video game cutscene and a plot that couldn't even successfully reboot the universe. It was specifically designed to reboot. Aquaman 2 is where it ended. The first film made over $1 billion. The sequel made $430 million, not because it was terrible, but because nobody cared anymore. Years of contradictory decisions, recast characters, canceled storylines, and broken promises had done something that no single bad movie could have done alone. They had exhausted the audience's willingness to try. The post-credits scene had a man eating a cockroach. There was no Justice League 2, no Snyder continuation, no Cavill Superman trilogy, none of the things that had been promised, teased, and then silently deleted since 2013. Just a man eating a cockroach, the lights coming up, and a decade of goodwill completely gone. James Gunn is rebuilding now. New Superman, new universe, clean slate. Maybe it works. The DC characters are too good to stay down forever. But the lesson of the DCEU isn't about any one director or any one bad movie. It's about what happens when a studio mistakes speed for strategy, mistakes announcements for achievements, and mistakes the audience's love for characters as unconditional. It isn't. People will walk away, and once they do, getting them back costs more than any superhero budget in history.